New Year's Eve, an Airbus A330 lifted off from Congo with a seasoned crew. A full cabin, and nothing unusual on the surface. It was supposed to be a routine overnight flight to Paris. But halfway into the climb, a tiny maintenance detail that everyone trusted suddenly turned the aircraft into a silent trap. And the worst part? The crew themselves kept making choices that pushed them closer to something no checklist could save them from. Until one unbelievable twist changed everything. This is the miraculous story of the Air France Flight 736, where experience overruled the checklist. New Year's Eve 2020, an Air France crew in Brazzaville, Republic of Congo, is preparing for a long flight to Paris. Since it's the holidays and the COVID situation in Congo is getting complicated, 136 passengers on board just want to get home. With them, the flight has 3 pilots with 8 cabin crew, and 2 maintenance technicians who are actually heading home. The captain is 54 years old with nearly 12,400 hours, but he only has 80 hours as captain on the Airbus A330. And the 2 first officers have military backgrounds, solid experience. On top of that, the senior purser has over 16,400 hours, which made her the most experienced person on the aircraft. But in aviation, while the pilot's age and experience build trust, the aircraft's age often generates doubts. The older a jet is, the more repairs and maintenance it goes through, and in most cases, that becomes the root of all the future problems. For example, this Airbus A330 is 18 years old and has recently undergone heavy maintenance in China, as its engines were removed and reinstalled, and no one had any idea how problematic that's going to be very soon. First of all, a 330's fuel system is complex. It has 2 tanks in each wing, with 1 center tank and a trim tank in the tail. Inside each inner wing tank, there is a small compartment called a collector cell, which gathers fuel and sends it through thick fuel lines or hoses straight into the engines. So when an engine is removed, these hoses must be disconnected. But the parts used to connect these hoses are tricky. They don't fit easily, and they can get misaligned very quickly. To be specific, there's a part called the flange, which often doesn't seat correctly. And if the misalignment isn't noticed during reassembly, the bolts could loosen completely, which might cause a fuel leak or other problems. Airbus identified this issue back in 2015 and updated the flange design by making it smaller and easier to fit. But replacing the old version wasn't mandatory, so many older flanges were still in stock and still being used. The fuel transfer between the tanks is handled by a fuel management computer called the FCMC automatically. When the aircraft climbs above flight 25,500 feet, it moves fuel from the inner tanks to the trim tank. On the contrary, during descent, it sends the fuel back without the pilot's command. But pilots still have one control over fuel. If pilots move the engine master switch to the off position during flight, fuel valves close, and fuel stops flowing to that engine. Keep this in mind until the end of this video. However, finally, around 9:13 at night, the first officer advances the thrust levers of this flight, and the giant Airbus accelerates down the runway. But inside the left engine, something has already started happening that didn't catch the pilot's eyes during the walk-around. The main fuel hose wasn't properly fitted after the engine. It held together for 6 previous flights. But on this flight, the flange finally misaligns, the bolts loosen, and highly pressurized fuel begins spraying out. But these kinds of planes already have a backup even for a leakage. There's a drain around the connection that is designed to pass the small leaks. So it's still dangerous, but what's 10 times more dangerous is that the crew notices nothing. Takeoff is normal, even the initial climb is smooth, and after getting the clearance, they climb directly to their cruising altitude, 38,000 feet. But this perfection is just the calm before the storm. After leveling at flight at cruising altitude, the captain begins his standard cruise checks, which includes the fuel check too. It compares expected fuel use with actual fuel, and pilots verify how much fuel remains in each tank. They repeat these checks at certain waypoints at least every 30 minutes during flight. And as the captain does the first check, he immediately notices something wrong, because roughly 1.4 tons of fuel appears to be missing, and that's not normal. But the captain doesn't worry too much. The top of climb fuel check is known to be unreliable. It can vary due to unexpected level-offs, reroutes, and weather-related changes. But in this case, they climbed straight to cruise without any interruptions. Then what happened to the fuel? The captain then assumes the true fuel quantity might be higher, but the aircraft is doing the fuel transfers without his command. When this happens, a large amount of fuel can sit inside fuel lines while moving between tanks. That can explain the missing fuel. However, the captain mentions the issue to his colleagues and asks them to keep a close eye on the fuel state. Now, when the two first officers study the fuel situation, they don't like what they see. With each passing minute, there seems to be more fuel going missing. They check the weather at their en route alternates because the more reliable information they gather, the easier the decision is if they need to divert. And after about 20 minutes, the relief pilot calls the captain back to the cockpit to give some seriously bad news. By then, they've lost about 2.1 tons of fuel, and on top of that, a huge fuel imbalance has formed. They had about 400 kilos less fuel in the left tanks than the right. Together, these signs point to nothing but a fuel leak on the #1 engine side. Now, can an aircraft like the A330 handle an imbalance of that size? Yes, easily. It can even go as high as 2,900 kilos without affecting handling. And solve this problem, the pilots only need to transfer fuel from one side to the other. But if a leak is suspected, you don't pump good fuel out through a hole somewhere. So first, they decide to go through the fuel leak non-normal checklist from the Quick Reference Handbook. If you are thinking why they don't rely on the A330's electronic checklists, ECAM system, the reason is simple. It won't trigger the fuel leak procedure until the situation becomes much worse. So to get ahead of it, the crew turns to the paper checklist instead, without knowing that it also comes with a major setback: bias, and that complicates everything. As the captain opens the fuel leak checklist, the very first instruction says land ASAP. This means an immediate diversion is required. They've already flown too far from Brazzaville, and at this point they're about 250 nautical miles from Yaoundé in Cameroon, and 520 nautical miles from N'Djamena in Chad. So Yaoundé in Cameroon is much closer, but the crew is slightly more familiar with N'Djamena. At around 10:14 at night, the checklist instructs them to shut down the engine on the suspected leak side, because this checklist's first priority is diversion. A leak can lead to running out of fuel mid-air. More importantly, a fuel leak creates a serious fire hazard depending on where the leak is. And an uncontrolled fire is one of the worst emergencies an aircraft can face. Second, the checklist guides the crew through steps to identify where the leak is. So it follows this procedure: shut down an engine with the master switch, fuel to that engine is cut off. If it stops the leak, that means you've found where the leak is. Otherwise, that engine can potentially be restarted, and they'd check another engine with the same process. And now again, bias begins to influence their actions. All three pilots on board feel strong hesitation about shutting down an engine, because looking at what they have in front of them, the crew doesn't think there's a real issue with fuel quantity. Plus, they had several alternate airports nearby and plenty of fuel remaining, even with this leak. So they avoided the checklist instructions. The captain mainly hesitates because shutting down the left engine at 38,000 feet would force an immediate descent and limit their options. Plus, Air France's culture also encouraged improvisation, making the crew more willing to ignore the checklist. But had they known what was really happening inside the left engine, they likely would have followed the procedure. Inside the left engine, the main fuel hose has not been properly fitted. The fuels are leaking continuously. And the drain that's designed to divert small leaks is now unable to handle the massive flow escaping. So fuel spills over engine components hundreds of degrees hot. The reason it's still not catching fire is the absence of the right amount of oxygen. Meanwhile, the captain calls 2 maintenance technicians to the cockpit. And together with the relief pilot, they move to the overwing area to spot the leak. But it's pitch dark outside and they see nothing. While they're gone, the captain gathers updated weather for Yaoundé, Libreville, and N'Djamena as a diversion airport. All looks acceptable, so once the relief pilots are back, they try to make a careful decision using a step-by-step method. But because they skipped the fuel leak checklist, their starting information is wrong. If they had followed the checklist, they would already be preparing for an emergency landing. Instead, the captain believes they still have enough fuel to choose where to divert, and he thinks the bigger problem would be flying on one engine, not the leak itself. At around 10:26, the pilots begin discussing whether to divert to Yaoundé or N'Djamena. As the aircraft is still heading due north along the route, it brings them closer to N'Djamena. At 10:32, the crew contacts the Air France Operations Control Center and explains the situation, saying that they've lost so much fuel that continuing to Paris is no longer possible. And they have decided on an alternate N'Djamena, as it might be more suitable operationally. The ops controller soon approves the decision. But at this point, something interesting happens. When the purser arrives, who happens to be the most experienced one in the aircraft, the captain briefs her about the leak and tells her there's no need for any special cabin preparation as they plan a normal landing in N'Djamena. But after leaving the cockpit, she makes her own judgment and decides to prepare the cabin for a possible evacuation anyway. Of course, this is a clear sign of experience. She knows she has extra time and chooses to use it to be ready in case the situation escalates. And if it doesn't, no harm done. Meanwhile, as the plane flies north, it reaches a spot where turning back to Yaoundé or going ahead to N'Djamena would take the same time. From this point, N'Djamena becomes the closer and better backup airport. But being close and preferred doesn't mean safe, especially when the crew hasn't finished their checklist. And as the plane keeps flying, the captain repeats his opinion that both engines should be kept running as long as possible, until the fuel in its tank drops below 5,000 kilos. But why? He says that it minimizes the risk of a sudden unplanned shutdown from fuel starvation. But there's an interesting pattern in their decision-making. The purpose of the four-deck model that they used for decision-making, which is a simple step-by-step method pilots use to make decisions in tough moments, is to help the whole team agree on the best choice by combining everyone's input, experience, and the facts they have. In these decision models, the rule is to let the least experienced person speak first, because their mind is fresh, and they might notice something others miss. But this discussion has been led almost entirely by the captain. He asks the questions and then answers them himself. The other two pilots only agree with his reasoning. As expected, the captain then calls in N'Djamena control, reports the problem, declares a mayday, and gets permission to divert. But the moment they descend, an ECAM alert pops up saying, "Fuel F used FOB disagree," which confirms the fuel leak and sends them to the fuel leak steps. Not only that, but the ECAM also clearly tells them to shut down the damaged engine. But instead of doing it, the captain clears the message and assumes the handbook had already covered it. Clearly, he starts trusting his own thinking too much. The relief pilot finally asks when they will shut down Engine 1, but the captain still wants to keep it running. But then the relief pilot checks the NOTAMS and finds something serious. Runway 05 at N'Djamena is under repair. Basically, it's the endpoint of the runway they were planning to use is under repair, which means the runway is now shorter and the normal landing guidance is not working. They can still try to land there, but the GPS path was made for the old runway. It might tell them to make a sudden change at the last moment, which is unsafe. So the controller tells them it's better to land from the other side, runway 23. And the captain agrees without asking his co-pilots. But unfortunately, runway 23 has another less obvious problem. The Air France guide says this place often gets strong tailwinds during landing at this time of year, even if the wind on the ground feels weak. The captain also knows this could be a problem, but he doesn't realize how serious it might get. So he makes two mistakes here. One, he undermines the tailwind problem. And two, he instructs to keep the left engine running until they exit the runway. During descent, the captain takes control. The first officer starts the approach briefing. And this time, a maintenance engineer enters the cockpit to report something dangerous. A streak of fuel was visibly running beneath the number 1 engine's exhaust nozzle. But in return, the captain only thanks him and says it won't change their plan. Which again shows he doesn't fully grasp the danger of a confirmed engine origin fuel leak. Because a fuel leak can turn into a fire fast. It happened in 2013 when an Airbus A330 took off with a leaking engine. The crew didn't shut it down, and during descent the airflow changed and the fuel burst into flames. Firefighters had to put it out after landing. So he should know that the leaks get far more dangerous during descent or when flaps move. Even small airflow changes can spark fire, which is exactly why thrust reversers aren't allowed with a leak. Even the first officer gets this and says the real risk is a fire. But the captain keeps focusing on avoiding a single engine go-around and the delay that comes with it. As a result, at 11:18 at night, a new ECAM fuel imbalance warning pops up, which leads them back to the same checklist that tells them to shut the left engine down. But again, the captain doubts the danger, noting there's no fire warning. At this, the relief pilot says shutting the engine down isn't a bad idea, but immediately adds that keeping it running isn't bad either. So it's a classic groupthink where no one wants to challenge anyone because everyone's confused. However, finally, the captain tells the first officer to pump the brakes, even though that doesn't reduce the heat. If they had followed the checklist earlier, the engine would already be off, the leak would be gone, and they probably would have diverted to a much longer runway. Instead, they're descending into the trouble they created for themselves. At 11:28, 1 hour and 14 minutes after they started the fuel leak procedure, the crew is cleared for the manual landing approach to runway 23. So they slow the aircraft to configure it for landing. They decide to use flaps 3 instead of full flaps in case the engine fails during approach and they need a single engine go-around. This is a good idea, actually, but also a bad one. Because choosing flaps 3 also means a higher approach speed for landing, which requires a longer landing distance. While the plane starts descending down the manual glide path, the pilots struggle to hold the right speed because a strong 32-knot tailwind is pushing them fast. That's dangerous on a short runway. A later calculation shows they actually need more runway than what's available, even with the usual safety factor. Airbus jets themselves have a system called ROWROPS that warns if the runway is too short. So as they descend, the tailwind finally drops below 10 knots. At 11:34, they touched down about 550 meters in, at 150 knots, which is slightly fast. And immediately, Rorop starts shouting, "Brake, max braking." Because the system now realizes the real distance is disappearing fast, and what happens next is simply a life-and-death chain reaction that turns into a disaster. The first officer urgently disconnects the auto brake and squeezes the pedals to maximum. But as soon as he does that, it starts dumping huge heat into the brake discs, all while fuel is still pouring out of the leaking engine. They manage to stop just short of the runway end, but by this time the brakes are already at 300 degrees. Even at this point, the relief pilot suggests shutting the left engine down, but the captain wants to make a right turn and needs that engine for steering. He even asks the ground firefighters if they could see the fuel trail, and they said no. So the captain assumes it's safe to push the leaking engine above 40% thrust to complete the turn. This was the point where they should have been in the fire. In fact, the moment the leaking fuel touches that burning hot brake, it should have flashed into a fireball. As the pilot adds thrust, the blast of air should have thrown the flame sideways like a blowtorch. The wheel well must have turned into a furnace, melting lines and cooking everything around it. A tire should be overheating, swelling, then must have exploded with a violent bang, throwing burning pieces out. And eventually the fire is supposed to claw its way toward the wing, turning the whole side of the aircraft into a raging inferno. While all these were normal to happen, what happens here in reality is nothing but a miracle. The fuel doesn't ignite. Investigators later thought the fuel-air mix inside the engine was so rich that it prevented combustion miraculously. The crew finally shuts the engine down after turning off the runway, though fuel is still gushing out. The aircraft lost about 5.3 tons in flight and another 400 kilos while taxiing. By the time they park, the brakes hit 600 degrees. The crew holds passengers on board until firefighters are ready. And fire crews then soak the area under the left engine to lower the risk of anything catching fire. They are lucky, and that's why even after making deadly mistakes, everyone walks away without any harm. But this incident shows how fast things spiral when pilots think they can outsmart their checklists. The fuel leak came from a mismounted hose between the engine and the pylon. Airbus told all A330 operators to replace the flawed part. They also rewrote the fuel leak checklist to stress the fire danger. Air France issued new training material and added a simulator drill. But the BEA's final message was blunt. Air France crews keep ignoring procedures, and the airline needs to fix its culture. The procedures aren't optional. They're built from real accidents, real failures, real near misses. They exist because in a crisis, your brain gets noisy, rushed, and overconfident. The captain had over 12,000 hours, but barely 80 as commander on the flight. The others were experienced too. Still, they all slid into the same trap. They trusted their instincts over the checklist. They convinced themselves they understood the risk. They didn't. Basically, this means the leak was a maintenance mistake, but the dangerous outcome was human. If they had followed the checklist, they would have shut the engine down and diverted to Yaoundé. They would have landed on a longer runway with cooler brakes instead of dragging 600-degree brake discs while fuel poured out behind them. Then how did they survive? This was possible only because the fuel concentration around the leak was too rich to ignite. But that's not skill. No one knew about this fuel concentration. That's hard luck, which won't always show up. That's why checklists exist, to remind the things humans forget under pressure. But when you ignore them, even after noticing, you're gambling with the lives of everyone on board. Air France 736 came frighteningly close to paying for that gamble. So here's the question. If experience can blind a crew this badly, what keeps the next flight safe? And more importantly, When does "I know better" become the most dangerous decision a pilot can make? Share your views in the comments below. And for more major updates on aviation incidents, just subscribe to the channel and keep following our works.